Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all, and welcome to another episode in our continuing live stream series, Iran versus the Epstein Empire. This is installment number 9, Feeling Politically Shi'i. We're going to talk about that and many other things in our roundup on the Ramadan War, which enters its second month. And with me, as ever, are my comrades and colleagues with whom I'm collaborating in this series. The co-hosts of Resistance is Fertile podcast. Benji, one of the co-hosts, great to see you, radical anti-imperialist psychologist. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you very much for hosting this again, our collaboration. I've been waiting for this all week. I've got some echo in my headset because some other thing is on. Let's get somebody else to speak.
Why don't you try and solve that while I introduce Indi, who's known to us all, of course, has a great presence on Twitter and a wonderful blog, and co-host of Resistance is Fertile. Indi, it's great to see you again.
Hi, it's great to see you, and I'm very excited to meet Mr. Bikrum Gill. This is a long-time follower, his first-time chatter, so this is going to be great.
Absolutely. Bikrum Gill is our mystery special guest. I'm really grateful to him for making time, kind of last minute changing in his schedule. So comrades, he's made an effort to be here. We really appreciate it. So we're going to enjoy so much having his analysis and participation. You all know Bikrum, hopefully you follow him, on X, on Instagram, but he's an anti-imperialist, geopolitical, economic and development and environmental scholar. And I think really one key issue is the question of sovereignty that you deal with, and that's in many of your handles. And so people should definitely be following your work. But Bikrum, it's so great to have you on this program.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. And I've been definitely appreciating all of your discussions and interventions. So I'm glad to have a chance to tap in.
Excellent. Well, I should remind everybody who's on that they can like the stream right now. Very easy thing to do. Boost it so your comrades and colleagues, friends, even enemies get a chance to see this on their feed. You can share it if you're on your social media. If you're, streaming, watching the stream on X, on either my X account or Indi's or Benji's, you can just retweet it, and that would be a good thing to do to let other people know about it. And of course, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Indi's YouTube channel as well. But also, I just want to mention that we've been doing fundraisers. Each one of these episodes, we've highlighted the work of the Samir Project, Palestinian Mutual Aid group. I want you to continue, to support them. We supported them particularly for the Ramadan Iftar program, the campaign that they had. But I wanted to add a couple of other campaigns, and I'll put the links in the chat. But one that I want to highlight at the outset is the legal aid fund for Nirdeen Kiswani's legal action against Beitar USA. You all know about that horrible organization, but even more recently, the death, assassination attempt. I mean, like, they wanted to kill Nirdeen Kiswani, one of these other ultra-Zionist terrorist organizations. And it became known quite recently. She had an excellent discussion about it where she was so dignified and serious in her analysis that of course she told us about the horrible things she's gone through with constant harassment, threats, and so on, but she framed it constantly in the wider struggle and what the political goals of targeting her are, so that it wasn't, you know, about her in a very personalized way. She wanted to always condition everything around the importance and significance of her resistance, the wider struggle. We need to be in solidarity with her. I'm putting that in the chat, so if you can give, you know, support to that campaign, I think it will be very important. You know, sounds like my audio is not great. Hopefully it'll be stable here. But like that's quite important. The other kind of fundraiser that I just want to quickly tell you about is supporting this summer's round of small private online.
We're losing you, Adnan. We're losing you. I think that, so, I mean, this fundraiser, I think you're doing a course, and then this fundraiser is to sponsor, as far as I'm from like 2 seconds of paying attention, to sponsor kids or young people in Gaza for that course.
Exactly. They will need internet access, and so if you can help, there's a fundraiser. I put the link in the chat to help them raise funds so that students can take this course. So if my audio is cutting out, we should turn it over.
Yeah. So I can just say hi now. My sound is back on. And I wanted to say, I wanted Bikrum to appear tonight so much that I wore my special magic t-shirt. Just to make sure I would increase the chances of you being here with us today. So yeah, your tweet, yeah, you in a tweet a couple of weeks ago, I think you mentioned Fanon, and especially the last part of the first chapter of Wretched of the Earth, this here book on violence in the international context. And I went back to read it, and it was amazing. It was like you were reading today's news, right? So thank you very much for reminding us of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, you know, I'll often reference those last 10 pages because it's a really interesting chapter. Of course, it's the most well-known and studied chapter in Fanon concerning violence, and it's one many of us have continued to help make sense of kind of the current moment. But there is an interesting shift that happens towards the end between an explicit discussion on the settler colony towards the international context, which is the point I'm trying to make in my work more recently. Is this is how we need to understand the distinction between colonialism and imperialism, and therefore anti-colonialism, decolonization, and anti-imperialism. What is the relation and what is the distinction between the two? And it matters. And I think in the piece that you're referencing that I wrote that and cited that in, I'm making a strong claim that we are witnessing right now the first actual real anti-imperialist confrontation. And I don't shy away from saying that. I don't think China in Korea in 1949 was at the level of anti-imperialism as we're witnessing today. In fact, the closest we may have come in some ways was Ansar Allah in the Red Sea War over the past couple of years. So I think like there's a truism Fanon encounters that he's you know, like what would it mean to take that equation of violence that he charts out in the settler colony and now map it on the international scale. And absent that, you will not break out of the imperial system. You'll have territorial sovereignty, but you will remain hemmed in to relations of military and economic dependency. So I think that's like that is, I think, the level at which we've reached today. Like that's how much is at stake, right? And I think, and the other thing I'll say is Fanon, he's also coming to this lesson through the assassination of his dear friend, Patrice Lumumba. You know, in his reflections, I think it's in the collection of essays called Towards an African Revolution. At this point, Fanon, he essentially says we erred, right? In working through the UN. There's like we should have taken the fight to that international context. There should have been like an African army fighting Western intelligence or proxies like at that scale. And you think about the loss of Lumumba and what that represents, the loss of the anchor that would have been in Central Africa to establishing not just decolonization, but anti-imperialism on the continent. And I know this is something we may discuss tonight, but Fanon, obviously, maybe this is a segue for later, but we know one of his underappreciated correspondences is with Ali Shariati, which may feed into some of what you guys want to talk about today. But it's a really interesting correspondence about the relationship between Islam and anti-imperial revolution.
Definitely. Let's.
Sorry, Adnan. Is it okay?
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is so important, and I think you mentioned that China and Vietnam were actually anti-colonial movements, and that's because they weren't at the heart of the imperialist world system, right? Whereas Palestine has been, because it's at this lock between West Asia and Africa, and also the Suez Canal and all the rest of it, and Iran is, and this is why on RIF podcast we've come to term what is going on. Maybe the greatest for the past 500 years, decolonial, anti-imperialist counteroffensive. Like the image we use is Gaza was Stalingrad, and this one is Corks, and Operation Begration is coming, and it will end probably in Al-Quds. And I think it's very important to understand, because what Brother Adnan calls the tyranny of geography. I don't like tyranny because it's whiny, but the realities of the world imperialist economy is such that this region actually holds the key to the throne, in a sense, right? And they have prepared that counteroffensive for so long. An empire can't let go of it, so it can only end in a victory for one of the two combatants. So our analysis is white empire is not able to secure victory there. And this is why you go back to Fanon and you get that point where, Fanon more or less says, well, decolonization is great, but if imperialism is still there, you're still going to have to go through the same humiliations, through the same subservience, through the same economic dependencies until this thing is brought down. But because of the particular geographic situation and the importance of energy, of course, still oil very much in our current phase, Iran is in that position where it's actually, at the forefront. It's the vanguard of the anti-imperial struggle, and it's actually completely overturned, Ali Kadri's analysis where he says only capital is the subject. And now what we are seeing is that Iran is becoming the subject. Imperialist is becoming an object. And a very important part of this is how those ideas are becoming a material force, to use Marxist terms. And this is actually through this very specific Shia faith in the Khomeini understanding of it. And Ali Shariati, I believe, also had a role in it.
Yeah, I want to thank Bikrum, because what he does is he puts like a theoretical frame around a lot of stuff that I think we're observing. So you could see that in Vietnam, in Korea, in Afghanistan, the empire was beaten, but it wasn't a strategic defeat in the sense that they could go on and pursue the same strategy somewhere else. Whereas what's happening in the Ramadan War, so if I'm correct, Bikrum, you're saying the distinction is between anti-colonial wars and anti-imperialist, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. So this is actually restricting their ability to imperialize. That they're taking material losses like AWACS and refueling like the weak parts in their kill chain. They're taking major sort of political losses, economic losses. They're taking losses that impact their ability to imperialize. And if we talk about the Ramadan War, they haven't even set foot in Iran. Like we haven't even got to the point. So what I've been saying is, if there's a guerrilla war, it's the Americans that are the guerrillas here. They're the ones that are hiding out in Dubai hotels, and they're the ones that are like, that they don't have air superiority for the first time since, I guess, in Ukraine, but they were too scared to show up in Ukraine also. So, I mean, what I've also been saying is this is a long retreat. If you look at it on a map, they've been retreating since World War II. They're like, okay, they took up Hitler's white man's burden of killing commies and putting down colored people. But they've been retreating since Korea, since Vietnam. They've been unable to conscript an army. Then since Afghanistan, since Iraq, they've been unable to really field a mercenary army. And then now they're just getting their stuff cleaned up. I call it a fire sale of the military-industrial complex.
So if I could just maybe one quick point to add on to this is, I think, and I would agree, the one thing that I think if people are feeling lost and confused with the, with the deluge of misinformation, like I like to wake up every morning and read the Financial Times. You can hate me if you want, but I think you can find truth in the enemy's. Well, no, let me not even say that way. But if you might feel overcome by this deluge of misinformation, but one thing we can track in relation, Indi, to the point you're making here is like, how do we define precisely imperialism? So the colonialism, hold on to the territorial question. Imperialism, what it is, it's what happens between territories. That's the power, right? It's the especially under capitalism, map and measure who is exercising control over the flow of the commanding heights of the world economy between territories. Now that's going to be capital. It could be semiconductor chips. It could be a core good like oil, which backstops the world currency. And the world currency is the oil in another way that facilitates this trade, right? So we have a very clear way to measure that today: the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea, right? And now we see the way the Strait of Hormuz is putting into play the pivotal question of U.S. imperialism. We've had British imperialism, we had Dutch imperialism, which is the relationship between the oil and dollar, right? Between oil and the U.S. dollar. We can actually map that. So they can say whatever they want to say in the Financial Times. They can say, well, it looks like Iran's going to, I think what have they been saying now for 3 weeks? Iran has used up 95% of their missiles, like day after day after day after day.
Yeah, I think it's like 200%. Now they're getting negative missiles.
It's like they just keep using up stuff they don't even have apparently. But we can map what's happening to imperialism and anti-imperialism at that scale. And we can look at how like China has been challenging this for decades now. And they're building an overland route to challenge the U.S. naval supremacy over this control over the flow of capital. But never was the fight taken actually to the root of U.S. power in this way. So that's what I would say to folks who might feel overwhelmed, is there's specific things we can look at and map.
Yeah, I mean, I attended over the weekend a really excellent conference, Unity in the Struggle, in Toronto. And we had a panel on identifying empire, who and what we are up against. And there was Ilan Pape and Patrick Higgins, who has been a guest on this program, wrote a fantastic piece about Syria gunning for Damascus. Very helpful and clarifying. I recommend it to everyone. It's available online. You can get it for free, no paywalls, etc. And I think that's a very important point, what you've been mentioning, Bikrum, about how it should be distinguished from colonialism. It also needs to be distinguished from older forms of empire, right? This word is often used. There was Muslim colonialism and Muslim imperialism because there was the Abbasid Empire or the Ottoman Empire. And what it fundamentally misses is, this whole kind of architecture of control and the way it operates. I mean, in the past, these old empires were just forms where you have a dynasty and many different peoples. That's what an empire meant, and was land-based. So it was very different from these nation-state colonizing powers, who then develop imperialism as a system that, while there can be rivalries within it, but it is a system in some ways, just like the whole architecture of the international order, first the League of Nations, then, the UN, as ways of kind of organizing and controlling the competition between imperial states so that imperialism itself can continue to function effectively and control the global south and eliminate, create some kind of zone of peace in the West, in the center of the empire, so that, all of the necessary violence can be directed towards the global south in direct colonization. And then where not possible to maintain, they can still have, as you were saying, the imperialist control. And so it's interesting to think of this moment where, Marco Rubio wants to go to the Munich Security Conference and talk about recolonizing the world. This is kind of a very audacious, and it's so audacious that it tells you it's because they cannot even dream of doing that. And that's, in fact, actually what is being contested. You were saying, that imperialism is being confronted much more directly, this kind of system of control. we'll talk at some point about, the not just the Strait of Hormuz, but also now with Yemen entering and potentially closing off or controlling, Bab el-Mandeb, that, this is definitely at that point, it becomes not just, a question of the energy and its economic effects, but all trade basically between Europe and, Asia then suddenly becomes much more expensive, much more difficult if they have to go all the way around. I mean, we saw a little prelude of this when a big super tanker that's too large for the Suez, the Evergrande, a Chinese super tanker, got stuck in the Suez Canal a few years ago, and how for a couple of weeks, because it took a while to, lift it out and unblock it, how that caused all kinds of havoc. That this would be a much more concerted and direct reframing of these conditions. So that's something I think really interesting. We should probably maybe we'll come back to this kind of question because you also had another tweet thread that we want to talk about that maybe connects a little bit with this question of, what are the consequences of removing imperialism,
Right.
so knowing what it does as it engages and controls the world, how it does it, and also what it means to try and destroy and remove it. It doesn't, there are different levels of conditions. So maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. But you already raised the question about Fanon and Ali Shariati. And, if people don't know, there's the published correspondent, Ali Shariati, who is one of the figures most important in some ways for reviving a kind of revolutionary idea of Shi'i theology, for, political action, and really a transformation of it that went hand in hand with other, kinds of developments in Shi'i theology. But that's why sometimes he's considered the kind of intellectual godfather of the, Iranian Revolution. And he studied in France and seems to have been very aware. He even translated some of Fanon's work into Farsi, so he was deeply involved, and familiar with his work. And they seem to have had an exchange of letters. Some people say maybe it wasn't. Maybe it's a, kind of like a risala, and an exchange of letters is also a classic form of intellectual dialogue, is that somebody writes one as if, and you take these two positions and you do it in a kind of epistolary exchange, or two different treatises where one responds to the other and they go back and forth. We don't know. I mean, that's an open question. But the point is that the things that Fanon says about Islam in that exchange are really interesting in identifying that, Islam and Islamic culture and civilization is a resource, and has historically been a resource for anti-imperialist confrontation with the West and West's empire. And the title of this episode is Feeling Politically Shi'i, because at this moment, we should all, in some ways, if we are anti-imperialists and want freedom for the world, be identifying with the statement that General Qasem Soleimani, for example, said, is that we are the nation of Imam Hussein, and what that means. You referenced in some of your work and comments, also a tweet, the Karbala, the story of Karbala, and how that is a resource right now for revolutionary anti-imperialist action. I'm wondering if perhaps maybe you want to talk a little bit about the way you might feel in this moment politically Shi'i.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would like to just offer a quote from Ali Shariati, which was actually posted on Twitter yesterday by Alden Markey, who's been a guest on your show, Adnan, in the past. I believe is from Yemen.
Runa Alden Markey, yes.
Runa Alden Markey. And the quote is the following: "Our intellectuals shouldn't be sitting in fancy cafes sipping 70-cent," that was a long time ago, right? 70-cent coffee and discussing third world issues. Their real duty is to connect with the poor in our society, to understand their problems, their thoughts, their faith, their responsibilities, and the burden they carry. Intellectuals should know the opportunities they are offered extract them like hidden gems and use them to mobilize the masses and guide them towards growth, awareness, and creativity. The role of the intellectual is to spark a revolution. I am absolutely no scholar of religion, Islam, or Shiism, but that strikes me as a very Shi'i way of thinking about the role of the intellectual, the role of the Islamic scholar as well. What do you guys think?
Go ahead, Bikram. Yeah.
Well, I think I think that's a really I saw that too. That's a very profound, I think, injunction there. The real duty is to connect with the poor in our society, to understand their problems, their thoughts, their faith, their responsibilities, and the burdens they carry. To mobilize the masses, guide them towards growth. But I think what it's just pointing us towards is, I want to acknowledge two people, and I'm just learning this myself. It's interesting when you say we're politically Shi'i. Like I'm very new to learning kind of this tradition and what it signifies. But I want to acknowledge my two people who've been really influential, helped me learn this. Amal Saad, who I've been discussing. I've mentioned her several times on recent shows, and Helia, of course, Dutagi, who I think was on your program earlier today, Adnan. I think, this idea that I understand of the Shia tradition with Karbala or Imam Hussein, and even I learned recently the significance of the Mahdi, like the reappearance of Imam Mahdi, or you're waiting for the reappearance for Imam Mahdi, is that there's an emphasis in this passage, even as an intellectual, to stand with the oppressed, right? To stand with the poor, to go to the poor, and there you will find the truth. Because otherwise, what happens to academics? And I'll tell you a story. I was at a conference last week, and so many people I have looked up to, or people I have viewed as mentors, who have spoken about decolonial thought in a really superficial sense, I'm discovering. You can be overwhelmed by careerism, right? You can be overwhelmed by expediency. Expediency overwhelms principle. And what is the story of Karbala? What is the story of Imam Hussein? The story here is to witness oppression is just as bad as conducting oppression, right? To stand with the oppressed and with the principle, no matter the cost, right? And to actually reject any sort of worldly bribes that would compel you to act in an unprincipled manner. So, and even death is preferable to indignity. And indignity, again, what is that? It's choosing expediency over principle. If there's a principle of justice, of truth, what does it mean to choose a bag of gold, a pile of gold? What does it mean to choose a promotion over that? Well, now for expediency, you've chosen untruth and injustice. And where does that lead the world if that's what our lives are centered on, right? So I think now we see, if there's a principle to prefer death to that type of humiliation and indignity, what are we witnessing today? Right? What are we witnessing today? Not just in Iran, but especially in Iran, but also in Lebanon, right? Obviously, we're talking about politically Shia, so we're talking about Palestine, but we're looking at who is at the forefront of fighting imperialism today. It is those who say they would choose death over humiliation and indignity. Now, we should not overly romanticize this, because nobody should have to suffer the death and destruction we're witnessing in Lebanon, in Iran. That is not acceptable. We should never assume that was ever a cost that should have ever had to be paid. But what we are witnessing is, who is it amongst us? When we see people in Yemen stand up and say, wow, I felt shame that bombs were dropping on Gaza, and they're not dropping on Yemen. And now I feel a sense of solidarity. And last week I'm at a conference, and these academics who stake their careers on this can't even do something as small as passing BDS. Something as because they're afraid of what? And I put this question to them: what exactly are you seeking to protect now? When the whole system can crumble down, why do you still not stand for truth and justice and these principles? Well, it is the Shia tradition, the movements that are at the forefront. And in doing this, in the same way that the tradition or the experience of Karbala and Imam Hussein demonstrates this, they are disarming the oppressor. So you see the United States comes to the Iran to disarm Iran. But when the Iranians stand up and say, we do not fear you, Hegseth. You know what Hegseth says? We're going to bomb and destroy. We'll kill, kill, kill. Death, death, death. And this is a question, Adnan, I put to Ali Qadri in Tunis a few months ago. What if capitalism produces death? What would it mean to reappropriate death from the capitalist, right? To say now this becomes a resource for resistance, to say, actually, we will determine the value of death within a broader struggle.
Yes.
So they disarm the oppressor in this moment. So those are, and again, I'm very new to this, and I do want to credit the two people I mentioned before for helping me learn this at this moment. But I think it is a very significant question.
I think you're right about that. And I heard you mention that in your conversation with Helia Dutari, a week ago, or I guess, or so, on East as a podcast. And I thought that was an extremely important observation, that even the ground of capitalists' kind of production of death can be turned against it if martyrdom is repurposed in a way to produce life, right? And this is something that I've been saying, that the people in those streets, in the squares, defying US and Israeli bombardment, to articulate their defiant spirit, their revolution, and their revolutionary demands, the fact that they're not going to be satisfied with merely, an end to the war. They want to determine the end as achieving some aims, some of their revolutionary aims of changing the imperial system. Like, this is a revolutionary goal. They're very conscious. And I don't think the leadership is in a position to be able to just simply negotiate on its own terms for some convenient end. They are responsible to this revolutionary spirit of people on the move. And those people, as a result of their resistance and their revolutionary facing fear of death, overcoming it, welcoming it if it serves the purpose of salvation for the world, as truly living. They are the people who are truly alive. Like, it's not, what we're doing is not really living if we're not part of this resistance that is truly living. So I think you're right, and that should definitely be developed, I think, because it short circuits the political economy of the worldly narcissism of capitalism, right? I mean, it's a way of short circuiting that, not to, just as Marx would say, that religion is the cry of the oppressed, but then they just project it into, into the afterlife, because they don't have the mechanism for world transforming today. But in fact, actually, it is a way of harnessing those spiritual energies that stand against the death cult of capitalism to actually produce life and change it here for everyone. And that is something that also is in the annals of anti-resistance culture. I think we're seeing something that is truly remarkable and unique, because these people are willing to make these sacrifices, not just for the national liberation of Iran, of Yemen, of southern Lebanon in the typical kind of anti-colonial war. They're actually trying to do what Fanon asked, which is, let's build a new humanity, and for everyone. And so, in fact, actually, they're doing this and willing to do this for the others and for the rest of the world, not just for a sense of let's free ourselves from colonialism, but let's transform the world through our revolutionary action.
I think we're seeing like a redefinition of life. And for me, it comes down to identity. So within Buddhism, there's this idea that the self is illusion. And if you observe that for yourself, you can see that. And there's many other ways you can conceive of identity and self. In Sri Lanka and India, even if you go generation back, people barely have sort of fixed names. Every name is referential, like age-based to your family, to your community. And within Islam, what I see is the Quran always talks about, loving death more than life. But Adnan, you can correct me, but I think the translation is probably more like loving the afterlife more than life. And it says like this life will be just but a pastime. And when you're woken up on the day of judgment, you'll be like, I was asleep for a day or part of a day. But there's this idea of a life that's bigger And capitalism fears that more than anything. We lost Adnan to the afterlife. Let's see if he comes back. He has risen. Okay.
It was here just for a day. He was there just for a day.
Just for a day. Yeah, Adnan, it's Judgment Day. I hope your underwear is clean. But within capitalism, that's all subsumed into this idea that you're an individual. This is your first name. This is your last name. You have to spell it correctly. You have to put it in your passport. This is your bank account. And you need to optimize everything for this individual identity. So if that means screwing over your family, screwing over your community, it doesn't matter. You optimize for this individual. And then there's a real challenge being issued here. You can see it in Iran. And America's cannot compute it because they're like, wait, we killed your leader. We killed your Navy leader. We killed this guy. And then someone else is there, like what is it? Why can't we kill this thing? They don't understand what they're fighting. They're fighting a different sort of self, and a higher self, and a self which is connected to God, which I think is above all sort of conceptions of self. And this is a real, you could say it's a change. This is the way people were for hundreds of years, but this is the decolonizing affecting, I think, in our own minds, our own sense of identity.
Yeah. There is one thing we discussed this morning a little bit, and I actually saw this on Twitter, but how the Iranian revolutionaries changed the term for imperialism to arrogance, right? And from my psychological perspective, I look to evolve some kind of dialectical materialist psychology that takes into account, of course, the political economy, the conditions of social reproductions, but also the systems of meaning within which we live. And when I read Ali Kadri, I saw Ali Kadri was very clear on this. He says capital is turning everything into a commodity. It's turning death into a commodity, but it's also trying to destroy social nature. It's trying to destroy people's identities, epistemologies, everything, right? And so at the psychological level, what imperialism does isn't extract your natural resources. At the psychological level, what imperialism does is it says your way of living, the way meaning has evolved in your social nature and in your community over thousands of years, with changes, with influences, with reforms, with revolutions, all this is for nothing. We, the white people, know what it is. And the arrogance of that, crazy white supremacist mind virus that from thousands of kilometers away, we should know how a particular community whose way of living, whose interaction with one another, with the neighbors, with nature, with the climate has taken so long to evolve. No, that's for nothing. And what it does psychologically is it says nothing that you've ever learned for the past 5,000 years is worth anything at all. So the psychological effect is one of being arrogantly pressed down as if you were worth nothing. You're not even subhuman. You're not even an animal. You're a sub-animal. They have more compassion for donkeys in Portugal than they do for children in Gaza or these schoolgirls in Tehran, right? And that was a stroke of genius to go and say, okay, well, psychologically imperialism is arrogance to the people who are on the receiving end of it. Why don't we use this? And Khomeini, as I understand, developed a new form of Shiism, which is much more politically active, which says, you don't just have your heart open to the poor, like we have also in Catholicism, I guess, but you actually have a duty to do something about it, right? And you have a duty also to defend your social nature, as Ali Kadri would call it, right? And I think that is absolutely at the heart of what has allowed Shiism to become a material force by that process described by Marx at the end of The Poverty of Philosophy, where he says, moving from the weapon of criticism to the criticism of weapons, and also having revolutionary ideas becoming a material force once the masses take hold of them. And it turns out that it's a stroke of genius to connect to something more spiritual, to some deep psychological experience, rather than say, well, you're being exploited, you know, your labor is being taken away from you, which is kind of the vulgar Marxist way of doing propaganda. And finally, I want to say one point. The question you asked of Ali Kadri, brother Bikrum, is absolutely brilliant, because Kadri shows how, for imperialism, death itself has become a commodity, right? So death is something that you extract value, profit out of. But what Shiism does with the culture of martyrdom, which, you know, you can find in every revolutionary movement in history before that, but is to say, you think you are going to turn our death into dead stuff? Think again. Our death are actually alive. Our martyrs are alive. We are transforming. We are stopping you from turning our death into a commodity, and we are turning our death into the one thing that will feed eternally our social nature, that will make our communities resist you until you disappear. And that is, you know, another of those dialectical inversions that is absolute genius in my view.
And I just want to add, you can see that attitude towards death in the way that the martyrs are treated in Iran and in Palestine and in Lebanon, where they're held close, and then people come out in mass numbers to support and to bury them, and the way the dead are hidden in America. That there are soldiers coming back in body bags, in coffins, but that's all hidden, and then there's certainly no love or support for them.
Shameful, undignified.
Yeah, you know, there's a question I saw, Adnan, you posted about, like, so Ali just basically said you should go ahead and think about that more. He encouraged me to, which I have been doing, and yeah, working on an article. Hopefully, Adnan, we'll get it done in the next sometime soon, and we can come and talk about it. But it will be in there. But it's interesting, this question on death in a way, right? Because, you know, like capitalism, if you think about it in one sense, there's a conceit that capitalism puts on the table. So it is about primitive accumulation. It is about labor exploitation, right? But there's like this concept of mastery that attaches itself to capitalism. What draws us into capitalism, right? The human being, or life itself, is bound up within a very deep contradiction. Is to live every day we move more. The more we live, the more we move to the end of life. There's this contradiction. We live every day, even beyond capitalism. Mm-hmm. So we put more into our life. Each organism puts more into living. It nourishes itself, but it's ending. It's moving towards its end. So there are many tendencies in our history that we have encountered in response to this. Now, the one element that's missing in how I think Western modernity has engaged this is that we are not simply of the earth. You know, I know in the Quran and in other faith traditions, there's this understanding that we are in the earth, but we're not of the earth. So what does it mean to be living this life, potentially moving towards death, but knowing that this is not the beginning and end of what our souls are, for example, right? Now, why does that matter? Because there's a fear of death that drives Western modernity in a certain way. You know, I know Freud talks about a death drive, but there's also this aversion, right? There's this desire to overcome the limit, which is never really in that way. But so to overcome the limit of death, to try to live forever, right? To try to introduce something like the world market, where we overcome the boundedness of place and time. You know, so if I feel disenchanted, or I feel a deep malaise because my life is going to end, well, if I encounter a market where I don't know where my shirt comes from, there's a mystical, magical quality to this. If I encounter a market that can potentially elongate my life in different ways. But the problem with that system is it prioritizes the immediacy of what we might call the dunya, the immediacy of the world, the immediacy of the interests of this world. And it puts, and then it compromises any higher principle in the service of the prolonging of that life. Because it forgets that we are not just earthly creatures, but we are cosmological in a scientific sense and a theological sense, right? We know we are of the stars. And I don't mean to say that to be too loopy, right? But it's significant, because then the attachment to this life and capitalism, I think, puts that on offer, and it kind of feeds on those insecurities, right? Now Marx, really interestingly, takes a dialectical approach to more and more unity, right? To freeing the human being, to realizing the sensuousness of labor, the creativity of humanity through labor, But there's a limit that comes to Marx. And I say this as a very committed Marxist, right? There's a limit that comes because, the dialectical process, it should take us to the highest unity. And what is the highest unity? Well, then we're entering into theological questions, but that's where it's kind of bracketed. And I think that's the significance of the Shia being at the lead right now. It's not that, and I think Benji, you're right, or Indi, one of you had said this, it's not that we've, or maybe Adnan, it's not that we've never witnessed a call like this before. It's not like we've ever witnessed anti-imperialists or anti-capitalists saying victory or death. Che Guevara says this. Che Guevara says this very famously. If we want to stand with the Vietnamese, don't just say good luck, Vietnam, solidarity, Vietnam. Walk with them, victory or death. Frantz Fanon in A Dying Colonialism, he starts that book in the preface by saying colonialism is dead in France because the Algerian has lost his fear of death. Once the Algerian has lost his fear of death, there's nothing that the colonizer can do. This is what also will open us up to a horizon beyond capitalism. But I think somebody also said it's very important. What did it take to universalize this injunction? To say this is not simply, and I'm not saying this is what the Algerians or Che did, because Che was a universalist. Where did he die? Che did go fight for humanity. But at this moment, when history is really calling upon, at this moment, existentially for all of humanity, for a force to emerge that can put that on the table, not just victory or death, but to say we subsume death underneath higher principles. It was the Shia tradition and these Shia movements that have stepped up for all of humanity, not simply just for Iran or Yemen or even Gaza, which will be at the heart of the world to come.
Yes, I think that the contrast, what you were saying, about the harnessing of those fears, through capitalism and sublimating, labor and time, manipulating time and space to kind of give this illusion, of extending life and so forth. I mean, it's very obvious now that AI and transhumanism, and the investment of these billionaires into trying to transcend the human condition is exactly the perversity of capitalism. And it's just, represented and portrayed itself now in the most kind of egregious and obvious ways of trying to turn the rest of us into animals as they become, kind of gods or, just some transhumanist kind of new creature. And so what the people of Iran are trying to show us, and the people in resistance that are trying to show us, is that there is a way to transcend those limitations by actually honoring life, by not having fear of death, short circuit those kinds of fears, and affirm humanity and humanness. Right? We don't need to be transhumanists to try and it gets back to something Indi was saying about the collective. See, the problem is because it's this narcissistic, individualistic kind of frame in which we're operating. But if we had some greater appreciation through solidarity, through collective resistance and our connections to one another, is that you don't then frame everything through this narrow lens of the individual, but you can have that kind of collective will, collective perspective. I mean, can you imagine any place where you would rather be right now than in one of those squares, just with these people who truly are unafraid, who are demanding better for all us, who are at the heart of the struggle for justice in this moment right now? I mean, that's living. To me, that's being alive, and that's what it means, is to connect with that in the ways that we can. That's what it means to be politically Shi'i, is to say we identify with that project and want to aid and assist that kind of revolutionary, transformative feeling that is being created. It's a beautiful thing.
And I think what we're witnessing is sort of the end of history. So I'll quote Fukuyama. I think like Bikrum reads the FT. I actually enjoy reading Fukuyama. It's nice when your enemy is like honest and gives you falsifiable statements. So he said, in the contemporary world, only Islam has offered a theocratic state as a political alternative to both liberalism and communism. But the doctrine has little appeal for non-Muslims, and it's hard to believe that the movement will take on any universal significance. So we're seeing the end of that, in that Islam is emerging as a coherent governing philosophy. which is capable of, I'm Buddhist, it's capable of inspiring non-Muslims. And so the End of History is an excellent work. I think it was written in like the 90s, but everything they said was ending is restarting. And obviously in like a Buddhist and Hindu sense, it's all like a loop. But this is a fascinating time to be alive at the end of history.
You know, it's interesting you say that, Indi. In an essay I wrote about 2 years ago in Ed Magazine under the title "Two Logics of War: Liberation Against Genocide," I have a section in there called "Beyond the End of History," and I'm thinking in similar lines that you're talking here, because it's interesting because like you're right. There's Fukuyama's talking ideologically, right? The end of history and the last man. Like this Hegelian movement has come to an end here. But you know, a lot of people bought that in a different way at the end of history. It was also a moment of apparent unrivaled U.S. power. Right? So that's kind of what indexed it. And a lot of people who ended up teaching me in graduate school, and I don't mean to pick on my mentors, but I think there's this weird in-between period of intellectual production between the end of the third worldism of the 1970s and then I think the 2010s. There's this space in between where a certain kind of intellectual defeatism, maybe unbeknownst to those who are even promulgating it, right, takes hold because of this overwhelming U.S. power that exists at this moment. But you know what's missed out on at this moment, and this is something I've raised in different parts of my writing. An essay I wrote on Iran in the summer, I brought this up too, is that there were counter currents to the end of history even at that time. Like you mentioned the revolution, but the Islamic Revolution, the rise of Hezbollah, even the rise of China, right? Like you had these things swimming against the current of the end of history. But unfortunately, intellectual production in the West did not take those counter currents seriously. It only could apprehend China as another USA. It could only apprehend Hezbollah and Iran as religious fundamentalisms, right? As things that didn't herald what they appear to now. So I think in the long sweep of history, I would agree with Indi that this is kind of, it seems like, there's something really interesting happening to temporality right now.
Yeah, and there's a point, I think, which a lot of the Western left and also Marxists have embarked on, which is this very theological reading of history, like this Hegelian, it will get to a final point. So after Hegel, you go, well, it'll get to communism or something. But this very millenarist idea, whereas having tried to understand more Chinese, Vietnamese approach to dialectical materialism, I'm seeing it like I'm now seeing Marx as the last chance of the West, of Western idealists and Western millenarians to rejoin common humanity, because people have always known that, life is about relationships and it's about opposites and it's about, contradictions. Like at the heart of being human, there is this tension between recognizing the other as the same as me, part of humanity as me, and myself as different, right? And you have supremacism that pretends that the difference is so large that it negates the humanity of the other, and then it takes you out of humanity, actually, because you become the minority, the big mass is you're excluded out of. And the idea that you can take everything to that level, and the same thinking about materialism, it's called dialectical materialism for a reason, but we believe it was just materialist, like maybe some weird reading of Spinoza or something. And so everything was reducible to matter, everything was reducible to wages, everything was reducible to some kind of, okay, so we're getting blood money out of the global south, but that's okay. But it's not like we have deep spiritual sickness in the West. I'm a clinical psychologist. We have an inflation of mental disorders that is actually a function of imperialism. They didn't exist 200 years ago, and hopefully they won't exist in 200 years. But on the other side of this, you have the human spirit that goes, no, I don't accept that you are superior, that we are not human. We are all equally human. And you see, like, the resistance, you see Islam taking up that universal culture. When people in Gaza spoke out to the free people of the world, they were speaking to that part of us, that knows deep down that we want to be part of humanity. We have excluded ourselves because of our racism and our supremacism out of humanity, but we can't live that way. We want to make our way back there. And the way they speak, they always go back to dignity. This is because it's undignified. The lives we live in the West are undignified. And could you play that little video? I sent the link. So and this is how, by the way, the axis of resistance is winning the narrative battle. Like, it is actually, it's pretty competitive on the battlefields, right? It's got the best missiles the world has ever seen, but on the narrative battle, it's taking the other side to the cleaners. So that's one of the Lego videos, and this one is particularly interesting because it shows how they are picking up the universality of all the victims of, in this case, US imperialism, but you could extend it a little bit. So please play it,
Yes.
Brother Adnan,
Okay,
and I'll say a
great.
couple of words to it. if I may.
Great. Settler colonialism.
Slavery. Palestine, Epstein, Malcolm. Rachel Corrie.
I think Lego is especially apt because Lego is made out of petroleum. So it's not just that like Iran is leading in the Lego sort of information wars, but I mean, they're controlling the supply of Lego, really.
I'd like to say a few words about this one. So you see they are picking up for the whole of humanity, and you see who's pressing those buttons, right? Native Americans, slaves, people of of East Asia, Rachel Corrie, the children of Gaza, the children of Epstein Island, the captain of that passenger flight that was shot down by the Vincennes, I think this US boat, everybody. And at the end, and so they are really fighting for everybody. Fukuyama, there's your answer. They have now gone to the next step. I think they have secret PhDs in psychological warfare in Iran that we've never heard about, because these guys are absolute, like psychologically speaking, they are absolute geniuses. And at the end of it, it says vengeance for all. And I think it's very important that it says vengeance. It doesn't say justice, because vengeance, you know, we've been talking about this on our podcast. Rage is necessary. It's not just, oh, it's bad, you know, it's not like those liberal tears anymore. We wish that people be nice and they stop being, frightfully terrible with children of Gaza. No, it's not this. You have violated what is most sacred to our humanity, and we demand vengeance. Our rage is going to bring justice in a violent way, because you have violently violated everything that stands at the core of what it means to be a human being. And they transform everything because, you know, I remember the time when I used to believe that Islam was a vengeful faith, like an eye for an eye. You know, Gandhi said, an eye for an eye will make the whole world blind. But if you don't take revenge and vengeance on these demons, they won't make the whole world blind. They will make the whole world dead, but not before having tortured and violated and eaten human flesh and doing the most depraved thing that I hope you're unable to imagine.
Yeah, to return to sort of Shiism a bit. So this is something from Khomeini the Elder, and this is something I learned on this podcast from David Yagubian, the word estekbar. So when we talk about sort of the one thing we're seeing in common is between communism, Islam, there's still an idea of a collective. There's an idea of a higher identity. And then within capitalism, it's very focused on the individual as sort of the commercial and the cultural unit. So what Khomeini the Elder says is, if we want to accurately define estekbar, today we compare it with the aggressive and arrogant US government. Estekbar refers to an existing power within the global community that disregards the will of people in other nations. It ignores human dignity, making itself the only important element, and dominates others with a sense of superiority. It bullies other nations with force and cruelty. This is America's goal today. If we want to find the arrogant in the midst of the global community, we look toward America. It was America's continuous arrogance towards the Iranian nation that caused Imam Khomeini to label it the great Satan. But estekbar, I think that's like we can call it individualism, you can call it capitalism, but I mean I think they seem to use the word estekbar, which is arrogance, which I think is a good way of putting it.
Yes, that is the word. So they were one of the chants that came out that Dave pointed out to us of people in the early days of these nightly rallies that are taking place all the time under U.S. Israeli bombardment. Was marber istikbar, death to arrogance, right? Which is kind of like, there's too many now. We've got to deal with America, Israel, these Gulf states that are complicit. It's like they just sort of wrapped it up in like one, kind of higher order category of like the arrogance of this whole imperial system.
And I think like the Satanism is also sort of, because so like when I read the Quran or even the Bible, I didn't quite understand the Satan story, because all he did was he didn't bow to man. I was like, well, why is that so bad? But you can see that like we have that inside of all of us, right? Where we don't want to submit to anything more than our own desires. And that's sort of like, and America's the capital of that. That's why they call it the Great Satan.
Yeah, I mean, it also reminds me, just when Benji was talking about the emotional content that's important in framing these resistance experience and goals. Yes, we could say justice. I think that would have been fine. I think what's interesting, you were pointing out, Benji, is that emotional kind of layer that's needed there. It reminds me of something, and we had an episode about it with a colleague about Malcolm X's statement when he was returning from, his travels in, Africa and surveying which countries which peoples had managed to and those who hadn't. And he said, everywhere where you see people sad, they're just still caught in their condition, but the mad, they do something about it. And so in order to actually bring about justice, and so that's kind of an interesting point. There's something that's been coming up in the chat here that perhaps we're so lucky we have you, Bikrum, because you will have a serious take on this, but a series of posts in the chat raising questions about whether we're just tolerant.
You're cutting out again. What I'm seeing in the chat is people defending Satan, so I don't know if Bikram's going to weigh in on that. But
it's not about defending Satan. It's about well, maybe they think it is, but about China.
So,
So,
you said it's good.
China bad.
You want me to get some static on Twitter again?
Yeah, well, it's like it started with, do you guys have no issue from Goldmo 2427? Do you guys have no issues with China, capitalism, and pro-technocracy, and relations with Israel and GCC, and then raised up a bunch of
I
other.
mean, there's a
Oh
lot of
my God.
misunderstanding
Yeah,
in those.
with podcasts we're lifelong China glazers. So yeah.
So, do you wanted me to respond to that?
Well, I think it would be helpful to have. I mean, there's a common kind of conception that China is just sort of reproducing capitalism just more successfully than the Western Empire. And it's even less about the whole votes in the UN and all that, but just that it's just replacing Western Empire with a China kind of dominated empire. And then a lot of other things follow from those sorts of conclusions to critique China's positions on various things, etc. But maybe if you could elucidate a little bit more about, what you would say China's position in the world system is.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So I'm not gonna say everything because that would take a long time.
Oh, I know.
I have a lot to say on this, but what I can say is, like China's position in the world system today is like, there's a basic way that I approach this, and I know not everybody agrees, but I'll just lay out the way I understand it. I'm going to go back to something you said, Adnan, earlier in the show, when you said imperialism today is not the same as empires of the past. Now, I wouldn't even say China is an empire, even in the way you had earlier imperial dynasties in China. But there's an important distinction that would hold in mapping this, okay, is that, how do you distinguish empires of the past from imperialism of the capitalist sort? Okay, imperialism of the capitalist sort, in its relations with its peripheries, is premised upon a dialectical relationship or a relation of development and underdevelopment, of draining surplus flows from periphery to core. There's nowhere we see that with China. There's absolutely nowhere you can systematically map that onto the Chinese development model. Now, why is that the case? So there's a principal reason why that's the case. Western capitalism is founded on entirely different foundations than the Chinese political economic system. Western capitalism is founded on the dispossession of the proletariat. Okay, so the dispossession of the proletariat introduces a severe contradiction. This contradiction is one in which the proletariat cannot reproduce their lives for 1 minute outside of the market. It needs all of its reproduction goods through the market. So therefore, capital represses wages, right, to increase its surplus value, but who will they sell it to if the worker cannot even reproduce its life, right? So there's a reproduction problem that a totally dispossessed proletariat encounters. That reproduction problem is subsidized by colonialism. So you see, from the beginning, you subsidize that problem. It's an irrational market system. Actually, capitalism is very irrational. That's why China's outcompeting it. It's an extremely irrational system because you can't have proper market competition if the capitalists run the market. You cannot have market competition won't do what it's supposed to do if you have such a massive, broad dispossession of all assets to the majority. Okay, so there's that foundation in the West. It introduces this contradiction that imperialism stabilizes, which means that Western capitalism is built upon a surplus value drain from periphery to core. China, the revolution, introduces the opposite. What happens in 1949? The peasantry are granted land. They're not even granted land. They take land. They're not dispossessed of land. You have, and I have this in my book, which nobody will ever read because, I never promote it, but that's fine. I've mentioned that a couple of times, but if you do ever read my book, you'll find this in chapter 4 of my book, is that there's a distinction I make between India and China. India has an armed landlord, disarmed peasant basis to its quote unquote anti-colonial independence, which means that even when peasants try to reclaim land in India, the armed Indian state, which is the landlord state, takes that back. That's the first act of the Indian army. The Chinese Revolution, especially once the communists are expelled from the cities and they go on the Long March in the Yunnan Way, it's grounded in a peasant armed power. It's grounded in what Izzeddin al-Qassam is seeking in China, in Palestine in the 1930s. It's grounded in Fanon's second chapter of Wretched of the Earth. And Fanon's a close reader of the Chinese Revolution. So it's an armed peasant, disarmed landlord. Why that matters for political economy, that means the root, the foundation of the Chinese state is not a dispossessed, universal dispossessed proletarian class. It is now you have access to land. So now if the form might look similar, you have Chinese workers in cities, it might look phenomenally similar, but those workers are subsidized not by a colonial wealth drain, but by access to land in the countryside. That's what subsidizes Chinese wages in the cities. So you see, the Chinese system is not built upon a resource drain from periphery to core. That's why China relations with the global south do not replicate the type of resource drain or interest payment drain that we've seen from 1980 to 2005 vis-a-vis the IMF, World Bank's relationship with Africa, Latin America, and the majority of the global south. So that's one thing I would say. Systemically, China does not operate. And I would challenge anybody to demonstrate to me anywhere that there's a systematic relationship of development and underdevelopment between China and any part of the global south. You will not find it. You will find the opposite. You will find the Belt and Road is distributing value in an entirely different way. Now, that does not mean that there are not contradictions in China's path. And the primary contradiction here is in China in 1978 switches from a focus on relations of production to forces of production. And it does so because under Deng Xiaoping, there's an understanding that it is not socialist to be poor and weak, right? That it is not the destiny of the global south or the non-West under socialism is not to simply arrive at equality, but to not have productive forces with which to withstand imperialist counter-revolution. So there's a rapid rush to rapidly develop the productive forces. And much of this comes out of the Cultural Revolution. You know, Xi Jinping's father and others who are gone to the countryside, they encounter a peasantry that has received land, but is still poor. It still lacks infrastructure, you know, universal electricity or power that can allow for industrialization, that can allow for a different future, that will not allow for imperialist subterfuge in the same way. But that requires an access to the world market because the history of imperialism has left the periphery without capital and technology. So the encounter with the world market introduces a series of contradictions into the Chinese system, which nobody should or could deny. But if we take a dialectical approach, we have to see how each of those parts are moving in relation to a bigger whole. So there may be parts in China that we find unsettling or that we would be critical of, but are they attached to a broader national development program that have lifted 800 million people out of poverty, that have reappropriated from the world market massive amounts of world economic surplus, which then they recycle back into the global south? And in recycling it back into the global south, they enable Malawi and Zambia in 2005 to say no to the IMF and World Bank. They say, no, we are going to reintroduce farmer subsidies. We're going to reintroduce a certain type of development paradigm that the World Bank and IMF forced them to foreclose. China has never done that. That is why China became a threat. And excuse me, I'm sorry. If China was what people claim they are, why would they attack China? China could just be Japan. If China was what people say they are, China could be like Japan. They gave China that offer after the financial crisis. Do the Plaza Accords that we imposed on Japan in 1987. China says no. Why? Why would China not sell out Iran? They could have done it again and again and again. Okay, so the history of China-Iran relations are really interesting, right? They come together post fall of the Soviet Union, post Iraq-Iran war. And first, it's a very instrumental relationship where the two sides are kind of using one another as leverage against the United States. But they both very quickly come to learn that you can never trust the United States. The Chinese learned this when, for a brief moment, they do abide by U.S. sanctions in the late 1990s. And what does the United States do? They bomb the Chinese embassy, I think in Belgrade, was it?
In Belgrade, yeah.
They bombed the Chinese embassy. So I think there's a strong convergence where China becomes, those surplus flows help countries like Iran withstand sanctions. Without that, you don't have a resistance project. But I'm not saying China is the key force here, because China also needs the axis of resistance.
Yeah.
Because they sorry, okay, let me stop there. But that was gonna.
No, but that's a very important.
I didn't want to go on too long, but
no.
that
This is
was
free
great.
university
That was
for
great.
us, for all of us. Thank you. I just want to add one thing: as China is a civilizational state, and I don't think we should engage with this person this much. I think it's the sort of questions of someone whose only window is a mirror. You get this a lot of times where people analyze everything in terms of, well, everybody, there's only one way to be. It's the Western way, so everybody else is going to try and be that way. And I can say, as a Sri Lankan, we've had interactions with China as a civilizational state for hundreds of years. So in 1409, Zheng He, who I'm pronouncing incorrectly, came here. He came in ships that were larger than the Nina Maria and the Santa Pinta combined. And unlike the British colonialists who took or the Dutch and the Portuguese, really, unlike those people who came and took stuff out, the Chinese came and gave stuff to us. So there's a tablet in Gaul which is written in Chinese, Persian, and Tamil. So they came and they knew. So let's say Tamil. Tamil is a sailing language at the time, but they knew our languages and our culture before they came here. So they came and they gave offerings to our gods. And they understood us, and then they pulled back. So I think that was really their first sort of interaction with the world market. And when they went to the world market, I think what they saw then was, I mean, there's nothing we want to buy here. Like that, we have everything in China. They were giving us stuff, but there wasn't really much that they could take back.
Exactly.
And in the modern sense, you can see that China behaves the same way. So I've dealt with people from, like, say, the Chinese embassy, as in we were just into like restaurants together, and they spoke in Sinhala and Tamil. So I would go to restaurants with this guy, and he would speak Sinhala better than me, and we were just confusing the hell out of waiters. But then I've also dealt with people from the American embassy side, and I've never seen anybody from that side that made any effort to speak the language here. Whereas even Sergei Lavrov, who's a foreign minister now, he speaks Sinhala. He was stationed here. So it's actually a fundamentally different attitude. It's not like they're trying to replicate the West. They have their own civilization. And to be honest, they have their own stuff. Like when the Europeans came here, they had no sunlight and no spices and no particular resources. Like China has spices. They have sunlight. Like they're not coming to take in the same way. It's just a different civilization.
Yeah. And I also think, go.
Just very quickly, I think, and there's an interesting question that's kind of gone throughout our discussion here, vis-a-vis either China or earlier when we were thinking about, like the Shariati Fanon discussions and so forth, right? Is that there's like a material basis to these distinctions, a structural one, but there's also something maybe somewhat like ethical, theological, almost metaphysical in terms of the different traditions, right? But, Indi, to what you're saying, like Adam Smith, when he writes The Wealth of Nations, he actually looks to China as a model. And his point is the problem with because Adam Smith's book, people forget, it's more a critique of colonialism in many ways than it is a critique of or an endorsement of capitalism. Because what Smith is saying is the proper structural foundation for a political economy is you start with the land, you start with agriculture, and you have an agricultural system, and from there industry comes, and out of industry trade comes. And he says the Europeans have it backwards. They generate their wealth out of raiding Asia, out of the, he doesn't get to the Crusades, but Adnan, I'm not going to open this because last time we ended with a discussion on that. We're closing the show and we're like, oh, let's just talk about the Crusades for a minute. And I think we went on for like 20 minutes.
It's not an Adnan show if we don't talk about the Crusades. He has license to do it.
It's dangerous.
But Adam Smith doesn't go to the Crusades. But his point is Europe has it backwards. They drain wealth out of trade, which is like raiding Asia, we can say through the Crusades, right? That is the basis of the wealth. Whereas China has a very different structural foundation, right? They have an internal basis to their wealth that they grow out of, but they do not need to dominate their peripheries in the same way, in which can lead to, I think, Indi, you're saying those cultural relations become very different, I think, than when you do encounter kind of nation to nation, state to state, society relations, right? So there's a structural basis as well, besides the cultural or other distinction.
Yeah. And I also think there is a philosophical and three dimensions that I'd like to touch upon. One is philosophical, the other one is strategic, and the third one I forget, but probably psychological. Let's start with the strategic. I think since 1945, world revolution cannot be pursued in the same way as before the atom bomb. You can't just go out there and beat the crap out of imperialists because they'll nuke you. So you have to find a different way to go about it. Bikrum said very eloquently that China faced this thing, how do we develop our productive forces? We're under sanctions and everything, and they chose to hug their main enemy in a typical Sun Tzu fashion so that they could increase their productive forces. And this is literally what they did, to the point that they actually surpassed the productive power of their main enemy, being the US. They know exactly what imperialism is about. They are consequent Marxists. They are not just idealists who want to fill their pockets. If there had been that, you would have had a Gorbachev in China, and they would have jettisoned all the Marxism. So it's not that. And also, when you look at the results like Ali Kadri does, you see continuous reinvestment of the surplus value, sometimes extracted badly, sometimes extracted, through some form of forced labor, through some form of bad deals internationally, for sure. But you see the actual results is an improvement in every single social outcome that you can measure. Literacy, health, access to infrastructure, to leisure, to everything that you can think of, right? It makes social nature reproduce itself and strengthen itself. So it's a different animal already. But you can't go after imperialists in full war mode. I want China to do more. I want China to send a brigade to Gaza or something. But if you do this, you are asking for nuclear Armageddon. And the problem is, how do you bring down this empire without, destroying the world? And it's a very complex problem. And thank God China and Iran are philosopher king nations in a way. These people are meritocratic to a fault. Like, you kill these PhD leaders in Iran, and they've got another 500 waiting behind, right? They're not game show hosts, right, by any means. And finally, there is the deeper philosophical point, which is about this deep respect of human dignity and self-determination. There's this Chinese saying that says, revolution starts from inside. An egg cracked from the outside is food, cracked from inside is a new birth. And you can't just go, and the Soviets did this in a way, and we Western Marxists did this in a way, which is not a sign, I believe, of white supremacy. You go out in the world and you say, you must follow Marx, Engels, Lenin, and this is the way to live your life, which is a negation of social nature, a negation of the people's, spirituality, psychology. And the Chinese are refusing to do this. But what they are doing is, in a way, holding space for a world in which we can do win-win. We can exchange like, normal people. We can respect the way other people organize their lives, organize their, gender relations, their everything. Why? I mean, the Chinese are saying, we can't tell you how to run your life. We know how we do it, and we change all the time, and we make mistakes, and we learn from them. If you're interested, we'll show you the outcomes and the process, but you have to do it for yourself. And that, for us Westerners, is a really hard lesson to hear, because we are the people of we know best. We are the people of arrogance. So we think we know best for everybody else. And based on a few CIA reports, like our friend in the chats, we think we know everything about China. If we see one little thing that they do that could be done better, that is the proof that they are bad and everything. This is a totally limited way to look at things. And I believe the role of China today, and also another way, think about the struggle now. The battle has been joined. Everybody knows China is helping. The targeting of Iran has improved to a level over the past 6 months that everybody who knows comes from Chinese satellites, right? And the Russians are also helping. Everybody knows this. And they are doing it in a way that I'll bet Iran in 5 years after it's won, they will turn around and say, the Chinese wanted to do more, but we said, no, our dignity requires that we are going to do it ourselves. I will bet something like this is happening. That's much more likely than the Iranians when begging China for help, and the Chinese said no way. And you hear it in what the Chinese say, the Chinese are throttling white empire. They have cut all rare earth, all tungsten. These people are spending their ammunition. They don't actually have the materials to make new ones. And then when the Chinese foreign minister spokesperson was asked, so are you going to stop supplying dual-use materials to Iran after what they've done? the guy answered, Iran was illegally aggressed under the Charter of the United Nations. It has a perfectly legal right to defend itself. End of answer, meaning, of course, we're going to continue to supply everything they need because we're on their side.
Yeah, this is interesting. Bikram, go ahead. You were about to say something. Go ahead.
So I have a question that goes back to something I wrote online, and I got a lot of flack for it, and I didn't quite understand why. So if anybody wants to help me understand this, I can't see the chat in the chat or online. So what I was going to maybe help, or not help, but just to maybe say for folks, like, you know, if you're looking at something like China or a China-Iran relationship, you need, like, how I understand the dialectical method is to help us understand the relationship between parts and whole, right? And to understand forms, how a form can exist and look similar, say in China and India. You might have the same form, but they may be arranged and organized under entirely different structures and systems. So you may have capital in China and capital in India, but that doesn't mean you have the same system in both, just because the same form exists. Right. So the point I was trying to make a couple of weeks ago was, it's not that you should never be critical or look critically at something that China is engaging in, but don't confuse parts and wholes. Mm-hmm. So, and that's a tough distinction to make. And I'm not trying to say this even to say that I would say there's immediately a predeterminate answer, but methodologically. So in the way that I would understand that, then something like a Security Council vote, it's important to be critical to it, but look at the way in which the relation of the whole is moving. Where does that part exist in relation to a whole? If the whole of the system is moving through the China-Iran relation in a certain trajectory, and if this part is contradictory, China's relation with the Gulf states, right? If there's a contradictory relation here, then maybe something that's been important for China to try to disrupt US relations, or for whatever reason. It's not to not be critical of it, but how do you maintain that a part can be contradictory? It can appear as a form that's similar to a form elsewhere, but still what we need to measure and assess is how the whole is moving. And so anyways, I know a lot of people had some vague, cryptic criticisms of that I didn't quite understand. So if I'm happy to receive those in more detail.
Well, I mean, I think it comes to, you know, something that you started to allude to, and you said, oh, I've talked too much, and you stopped. We could have continued there. Maybe we should. But the point is that actually Iran is absolutely crucial and vital to the reorienting of the system that China is trying to build, is part of building. And so that's why it is absolutely vital that Iran not fall, because how are you going to have your Belt and Road? How are you going to have these connections between, you know, which is to go back to the historic connections of the Silk Road, for example. I mean, integrating, I mean, the world system integrated China with the, you know, western part of Asia. You know, these links have to be there for it to be a truly world system, right? I mean, so, you know, it is absolutely vital that Iran, you know, maintain itself, and those projects need Iran. And in fact, actually, I would argue that in the end, what Benji was saying, I think we will find out that Iran, you know, received some help, but they also did many things on their own. They have an incredible indigenous, strategic and industrial base that they can kind of integrate and learn, you know, from China, receive some aid, but it wasn't like some wholesale kind of one-way transfer and traffic. That this is a group of nations that are trying to construct a different world system. And they each have roles to play, and that's why, you know, some of Iran's military technology has been really useful for Russia initially in the Ukraine, you know, war, and now they're learning from, you know, Russia's use of Iranian drones in Ukraine for improving the Iranian drones. And, you know, this is how technology kind of transfer in an emerging new world system is going to happen. And so I would just want to emphasize how important a role Iran has right now in the fight against empire. And so I did tweet, you know, about it and wrote that, I'm not sure, Bikram, I probably overhyped a certain a bit of it. But what I wanted to say is one other component that Iran is contributing is the Psy war, is the information war, is the culture of resistance. Okay, because that is something that we're not seeing elsewhere. And we're talking all about Politically Shi'i and how it is a resource that has been used and refined and developed as part of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist resistance culture. And that is a contribution. Not that all of us, everybody has to be, come a Shi'i Muslim, of the revolutionary variety, but to recognize and understand that certain kind of commitments and concepts and capacities are being contributed by their example, by what they're producing right now in terms of a form of revolutionary social solidarity and consciousness. We have to recognize the people of Iran. And if you watch any of these video clips of, people, soliciting comment of, people in the streets and what they have to say about the situation, and many of which are Helia Dutari's wonderful interviews with people, is that we are dealing with a population that has a higher political consciousness and understanding of the aims and objectives of revolutionary activity than pretty much anywhere in the rest of the world, because there's still many people who lived through the revolution, they've overthrown their imperialist government. They have now suffered 47 years of trying to protect that sovereignty with many contradictions and tensions and issues and problems. But now in this moment, they are reviving that very heritage and consciousness. And that's a big contribution, culturally speaking, to the culture of resistance. That's something we could really, I think, appreciate as a resource that is also something to the new world system. Is we should learn to have a kind of culture like this ourselves. They are showing us the way of how you defeat fear, how you contest the meaning of death under capitalism, like we were talking, and how you give an inspiring example for what is possible, right? So that's an important component too.
Yeah, I'd like to read something from Khomeini the Elder. So I think we're dealing with basically a higher consciousness here. I think a lot of people lose heart every 15 minutes or every day or so based on the news cycle. And that's not the cycle that these civilizational states are operating on. So this is something Khomeini said after Khomeini died. So I think he would have said this in the 80s, but it sounds like he's talking about today. So he said, today, the eyes of the world are on you. The world is noticing this nation. Millions of hearts pound for the hopes and goals of this nation. You have become a model. You have become the martyrs of Ali. You are the flag bearers of freedom and resistance against the world's oppressors and domineering powers. Today, nations show courage and no longer wish to be subservient to the major powers. There is a day that this courage did not exist. You opened this path for them. The actions of this nation under the strong leadership of that heavenly Imam opened up the path for freedom. He emboldened the nations and made the arrogance of superpowers impotent. He inspired virtuous contempt for domination, estekbar, and showed that all nations and citizens have power. The oppressors denied the innate power of human beings and sought to control people through superficial powers. And then he goes on talking to the people directly, saying, the weight of this mandate of leadership is on your shoulders, and especially on the shoulders of your government's officials. We cannot lose a moment, be negligent, lose heart, or become depressed. We cannot tolerate these things even in our private thoughts. Now, he's saying this in the 80s, right? And then I grew up in the 90s. As Bikram said, with his experience in academia, it was like Margaret Thatcher said, like Tina, there is no alternative. And I always thought, and look, in Sri Lanka, we just, like, whatever, the oil shock of the 70s sort of killed any socialism we had. And we've just been on a sort of survival basis since then. And for a long time, the way to survive and to get resources, especially oil, energy, was to bow to the empire and to deny your own dignity and essentially go through humiliation. And what Iran is doing now is they're saying, with Hormuz, which is the choke point for all of this, now Sri Lanka is able to get oil through there just by talking to Iran, but we don't have to humiliate ourselves to do it. So it is changing material reality. But for a long time, all we could see was the wicked being rewarded and the collaborators being rewarded. And Iran is changing that equation, and that changes the world. So just as you saw sort of like the AK-47 on like a lot of liberation movements flags, I think we may see like the Shahed 136. It's and that's an indigenous thing. You could say they're getting satellite from Iran or China or whatever, but I mean, honestly, these American things are not that hard to find. These, you can, from the heights of Iran, you can probably see it with a telescope, the stuff on the Gulf. And these things are just parked in the middle of the desert, and they don't seem to move them out of their now suicidal estekbar.
That I would like to make a point. Somebody in the chat said there is no socialist bloc anymore. And well, that's a very good thing. You know, like I go back to my job, my day job as a clinical psychologist. And over the years, I've learned that my job is about bringing my clients to the point of self-determination. And I never can do that if I tell them, you should do this, you should do that, you're part of this, you're part of that. And so this idea of a bloc is actually reactionary. Again, it's a supremacist idea that you can all move in the same way. Whereas when you think about what the resistance is doing, it's not called the block of resistance, it's called the axis of resistance. And in fact, Westoids can't understand how it works. You know, people couldn't believe that Yahya Sinwar and the resistance in Gaza made their own decision to open the gates to the flood on their own. They didn't go and ask for permission from Iran, from Hezbollah, or from whoever. It's an axis. People do what they want to do. They're self-determined, and they see others who want to do the same, and they support one another, and they share technology, and they share money, and they share weapons, or whatever you want, and ideas. But at the end of the day, they respect one another as sovereign beings, as sovereign movements, as sovereign nations, as people worthy of self-determination. You cannot do this if you think in terms of blocks. That is not the way to build a world in which people are fully respected for what they are. And I believe that what China is doing is precisely respecting this. Are they doing it perfectly? Of course not. Nobody is. You know, being alive is to make mistakes. Life is a messy thing. It doesn't always smell good, and it always ends in death, right? And in between, you have lots of mistakes. But we are part of life, and we are here to sustain it and to make those mistakes in such a way that we don't impose our own mistakes on others.
So, like, from the resistance, right, from Hamas, even at the worst of times, and obviously the unity, the fields, the different groups, I've never heard them ask for help directly. I've never said, oh, come in and save us. I've heard them tell other Arab nations like Abu Ubaidah, you should do this for your own souls, or you are being humiliated and this is shameful. But that's really like kind of for their souls. Even Yemen, so like Iran isn't really asking for help, because I think that's what's at stake here. It's people are not trying to replace the king with a new king. They're trying to replace the king with an idea of sovereignty. And that's what unifies all these different, you know, China, Iran, like Palestine. These are very different political systems. But what unites them is the idea of sovereignty. And I think a lot of people, I invite you to just read the people that you're condemned. So read about China or read about Iran. You'll see that they actually think differently. It's not like they're not trying to replace the empire with like the white empire with like a brown empire. Like it's not, doesn't work that way. Like, but what people are fighting for fundamentally here is sovereignty and freedom.
Yeah, so I think I would very much agree, and I think it's an important point to emphasize on Iran, the significance of Iran and its endogenous capabilities. I would just add to things that were just said. I think, you know, the China-Iran relationship, for example, they have enriched one another in a way, right? The way in which they work together to reverse engineer technology, because the history of imperialism is as such that the periphery finds itself in a technology and capital deficit. You know, and the question that development scholars face at the outset, or decolonization faces, how do you overcome that dependency? And so there are ways that you can do it through reparations. If reparations don't come, you can do it through the China model of trying to reappropriate from the world market, or there's this thing called South-South relations. And we've seen this in the China-Iran relationship, especially in terms of technological cooperation. And, you know, there are things that are obviously very troubling, like I was saying about China's path. But let's suppose if China is trading with the Zionist entity and it is able to, through espionage, pass on technology or engage in reverse engineering with Iran. But I think there's something that I would want to emphasize here in the way in which the China model is one, obviously, that people know that I believe in very strongly, but maybe it reaches a limit, right? Maybe there's only so far that it can take things. And this is where the Islamic Revolution becomes pivotal, because China understands at a certain point, it relents upon this idea of exporting revolution by a certain point, right? It understands the need to rapidly industrialize, similar to the Soviet Union's new economic policy, right? That there has to be an industrial base, similar to the Soviet Union, even after World War II. You need to build a strong national industrial base. But, some points that Adnan, you were mentioning, from the inception, the Islamic Revolution was never just about Iran.
Absolutely.
Like the role that Palestine has played in the material understanding that no one, like Indi, the point you're saying, no one is sovereign unless everyone is sovereign in the region. And Palestine was the heart of that in the Islamic Revolution. It wasn't just a slogan.
Yeah, Palestine is in their constitution, yeah.
Palestine is in their constitution, but this is maybe a qualitative, this maybe gets to what you're getting at, Adnan. It's not that there was not a universalist element to the Chinese Revolution. Certainly, we should not forget Cuba. When I keep mentioning
Cuba is the big.
When I keep mentioning Iran's stand today, the closest we might find is the way in which Cuba intervenes in Southern Africa.
Agreed.
In the era in which the Afrikaner apartheid state is acting like the Zionist state, the Zionist entity today, right? The way it's trying to expand war to the entirety of Southern Africa and maybe even beyond. But there's a way in which the Chinese approach had to take this road, because it had to appropriate the productive forces. And this was the only route available, but it introduced contradictions that may have limited where it could go. And this is where the Islamic Revolution introduces a different dynamism, right? That bursts past those limits, okay? Because it is centered on Palestine, not just as a slogan, but as a material structural relation and something much deeper, like we've been seeing. And maybe that refusal to give in any sense, well, no, there is a rational, practical component to Iranian foreign policy, but there's something else there too that may have been lost in some ways in the post-1978 Chinese path, out of necessity, perhaps we could say, right? If that makes sense. So I just wanted to come back to that, to say I'm not in disagreement with that at all. I just think on the question of the China-Iran relationship, there has to be a whole of system type of approach.
Yeah, that's the thing. These are not static, kind of conditions. These developments are historically moving, and we will see. It's not about like apology for China just to be, supporting China. I mean, I feel some of the people who support Russia are a little bit like, just, I don't know, they seem to have adopted a kind of Russian nationalism.
Although, like Justin Poder said, kudos to Russia for the oil tanker reaching.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. He actually posted an apology form to Russia, right? And there should be an apology form to China.
Yeah, I meant apology in the sense of defense of, but like we must apologize if we're wrong. So see, this is so wholesome and healthy to see that I think what's happening is it's slower than we all want. We want to see everyone join in the struggle immediately to overthrow the empire. We want it now, like we're capitalists from the West.
Yes,
and, consumer capitalists, we have to have it now. But as somebody put in the chat, these are two, like Iran and China, civilizational, nations that are very patient, right? Because they've been around for a long time. So, but what I think could be happening is that there could be more ideological development taking place, being inspired by this example, that like leads to some courage to like, let's break this China blockade. I said on the first day, I said, now is the time. China should take Taiwan, and that we should, break the siege on Cuba, because the US and Israeli front is wrapped up in like, make the sacrifice of Iran worth something. I mean, they will be worth something because Iran itself could conceivably help reorient the structures of the world system with what it's doing. But now is the time, in fact, actually, where one might take advantage. I mean, it's a lot like, it reminds me of the moment when the US was bogged down in its war in Iraq, occupation right after its war on, and continuing occupation in Afghanistan, and you saw that the Bolivarian revolution managed to kind of spread a little bit more. The so-called pink tide in Latin America emerged during the late 2000s with a lot of developments socially that were progressive, for people's solidarity and people's projects that might not have been possible when you have the US in its typical role of holding down everything in the Western hemisphere and subverting people's movements, people's governments, the way that they have historically in the past. In some ways, it was stressing the capacity. They weren't able to control everything that was happening, and that was beneficial for people. And hopefully we'll see more of this. I mean, this is why what's happening now is potentially of world historical significance. And we might see, just as you were saying, Bikram, it's quite an interesting, thought that, Iran might be contributing something very important, not just through its confrontation with empire, but in its example, the fact that it is proving relatively successful so far. I mean, there's a long way to go. Wars are unpredictable. One should not take for granted the capability of the people to resist. It's, we're all amazed at the people of Gaza and of Palestine. We're amazed at what the people of Iran are showing. We don't want to, rely 100% on them having to make every single sacrifice. We have to do our part and contribute, but, the point is that's inspirational. And that could, in fact, actually encourage other groups to seize the moment to join what we talked about last time, the madrasatul muqawama, rather than the madrasatul imbitah, the, school or orientation of resistance, rather than that of subservience and subordination.
Please, people in the chat, be civil to one another. Insulting one another kind of sucks the oxygen out of the room. So that would be nice. On that point, I want to. There is a very particular contradiction at play that I believe, and I'd love to hear Bikrum's view on this. We discuss it with Indi often, so I kind of know his view, but he can say that because of where it is, because it's, at the place where it's locking in the energy markets, because of the way the empire is this totalizing system that is non-agreement capable, non-negotiation capable, not capable of taking yes for an answer, right? When they attacked Iran had given them more than they had given in the JCPOA, right? It cannot end in another ceasefire. I don't see it. Also, there is the movement of the Iranian masses behind this. I don't think the Iranian masses will stand for, okay, we ceasefire now, and we know exactly what a ceasefire is now for settler colonies, for imperialism. It's just a way for them to recoup and prepare the next violation. I mean, a ceasefire with the Zionists, ask Lebanon what it means. In 1 year, 15,000 violations. A ceasefire with those people is you seize and we fire. So there is no place for this anymore, and Iran knows it, and they say it in what they say, and so far they haven't lied a single time that I can identify. And therefore, this ends with the defeat of white empire, and it ends in Al-Quds. The question is, does it end in DC without us, in the belly of the beast, having to do anything about it? By the way, when it ends in Al-Quds, the empire will be so weakened that China won't have to take Taiwan. Why would they take Taiwan? Why would they actually start killing Chinese people on behalf of empire? That would be crazy. The Taiwanese already, they watch so much mainland television that it used to be Taiwan, at the standard of living so much higher than the mainland. Now it's exactly the opposite. You look at Taiwan and you look at the mainland cities. Nobody wants to. I mean, they might still want to live in Thailand, it's in Taiwan itself, but not, in the shithole cities that they have become. So it will just happen because the empire will be too weakened. One thing that Abu Bakr said on our show, was it yesterday, was very interesting. He said, you guys in the belly of the beast, if you think we, by our sacrifices that will free ourselves, are going to free you, think again. And maybe it's possible, and I don't know what you think about this, Bikram, but that empire could actually retract and retreat a little bit like Michael Hudson is saying, right? And just turn against its own people in a very kind of, shrivelly way, but the cruelest ever, and possibly try to take the Western Hemisphere with it. And then we'll have to face the question now, okay, so what are we willing to pay? What are we willing to sacrifice to get rid of that, blood-sucking monster that means to turn on us and not just, give us a little bit of the blood of the global south so that we let it do what it does.
Yeah, and as Benji was saying about therapy, like you can't make someone do something. And as we saw at the end of World War II, which was the last big sort of anti-colonial opportunity, there were countries like China and Iran and Congo that fought for their independence. And they won something, even if, as in Congo, they end up losing it. But you can see the difference between China, where they fought for freedom, and say India, where they sort of just, and Sri Lanka especially, where it was just sort of given. And I feel in a very real way, if you don't fight for it, you don't have it. It can't be given to you. It can't be just be like inherited. Obviously, I think if the empire falls and there's less just hostile cooing and corruption pressure, there's more, everybody seems to naturally like some sort of socialist government if they're left alone. There's never been sort of like a capitalist liberation front of any country, but like we still have to like fight for it. And it's Iran and Palestine aren't going to free us, and to be honest, they don't need us to free them, but we need to free ourselves for our own sovereignty as nations and for our own souls.
Right, and I think this speaks to something. I wrote an essay about 5-6 months ago on sovereignty, about the internal and the external basis of sovereignty. Right, like I think, and I'm going to get to this in a way because the settler colonial capitalist basis of a sovereign project, how that needs to be transformed. But I think what I would say in the first instance is, Benji, where you just started this round of discussion. I have been saying for some time that we need to, even though it's clear that U.S. imperialism has been in crisis and that it is a dying imperialism if we were to play on Fanon in that way. But at the same time, I think I would insist that one has to hold two times, right? One has to hold two temporalities at the same time. A future where you're heading towards, which is a post-imperial future, the defeat of U.S. imperialism. So a future that is to come, but a time that is also too late. And I insist on this because, like where I started in my remarks on the program earlier, it should never be the case. However, we're saying that we're reconceptualizing death or locating it in a different cosmology or with a different value. It should have never been the case that Gaza should have happened for Palestine to be free. It should have never been the case that those schoolgirls in Minab should have had to have died for U.S. imperialism to have fallen. We must hold that every single day. Every single person who has been slaughtered, every single child, every single doctor, every single nurse, as they try to decimate the social reproduction capacities of these societies, as they lay waste to them, we must keep in mind that there's a lateness to everything, that should not have had to have happened, because that is what should fuel us with the urgency that we need. If martyrdom fuels struggle, it is not simply because that principle is chosen above death. It is not simply because you choose a dignified life over death. It is also martyrdom fuels struggle because there's a sacredness to life as well. Okay, so there's something else that could have been. All of those lives lost need not have been lost. Okay, there was something sacred, even though our lives do not begin and end on this planet Earth. It is still sacred the way it comes together here. And what could have been an expression of something divine or sacred was taken by the forces of evil. So we must hold that time. as we hold a future towards a post-imperial future. So I just want to emphasize this point, and this is going to help, I think, make sense when we come to the urgency of how people approach where they are in the core, and maybe why there isn't an urgency right now to an anti-aggression, anti-war type of movement here. Now, on Iran specifically, they fight for the girls in Minab. They fight for the assassination of Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei. These are battles that are happening that they fight, in memory of those sacred lives as well, and an understanding of martyrdom. But I would agree that they cannot defeat Iran, just like they could not defeat Yemen. We see the same script happening that happened at this very time last year. Between March and May of 2025, the United States attacked Yemen with the intention of opening up the Red Sea. Now, I know the Strait of Hormuz was closed after, but there's a similar dynamic that the axis of resistance has introduced everywhere that is not, the origin is not North Korea, but we know that actually the villain that stands behind, not behind, but the other villainous state for the West is North Korea, because North Korea also has a material basis of its sovereignty that it cannot hit. When we think about underground missile cities, when we think about the Palestinians in Gaza, what are they doing in those tunnels? Why does it drive the colonizer and the imperialist mad? Because they cannot get to the root of this. They know they bomb Hodeidah in Yemen. They know they're bombing Tehran, but they're not actually getting to the basis of the sovereign capacity. There's a reproduction and replenishment rate they cannot touch, which is why they start to slaughter, not the only reason, but when they start to slaughter the unarmed, when they start to go after scientists, when they destroy schools and universities, they're trying to do two things. They're trying to decimate the will of the society to turn against their resistance, to surrender. But they're also trying to remove the social basis of that resistance that builds up those underground missile cities that are impenetrable through these $1 million missiles. So what is not fascinating, but really revelatory about today is to look at Iran. Okay, Iran cannot be apprehended as a weak state. And this is something that I think the Western left maybe struggles to come to terms with. Because even with Palestine, even in Lebanon, even in Yemen, to a lesser extent, there's a way in which there's this narrative that can be hatched. We need to help them, right? Like what's happening in Palestine. But you cannot say that to Iran. And I'm not saying the Palestinians do this, or the Yemenis do this, or the Lebanese. None of them project this. Like you were saying, Abu Ubaidah, they don't project this. But Iran has attained a level of power and a parity, in a certain sense, that refuses any sort of colonial intelligibility, that will allow for Iran to be approached as either a child or a victim, either a child to be developed or a victim to be saved. There's a power that is projected. So there is going to be a crisis of U.S. imperialism. I 100% agree. But I wrote about this today. What does that mean? You're asking for the core. And this is where I think it's very profound. And I think I agree. There is something that, Fanon and others have talked about this. Imperialism and colonialism, we don't want to overstate the fact. It immiserates the peripheries. Okay, it immiserates the peripheries, but it does damage something in the core. Okay, now what does it damage? We live in societies that are weak and frail in their capacity to turn around and look at themselves. Okay, what does Mao Zedong say every morning? Every morning, like you wash your face, engage in self-critique as an individual and as a party. And we know in these societies, we all have personal experience. I can tell you how many death threats I've gotten over the last year. Anything you say, people want to kill you if you criticize U.S. foreign policy. The softness, the frailty, they cannot, because they, instead of turning around and looking at and reshaping their internal relations on a more just basis, they defer them and they seek to subsidize their contradictions through imperialism. Okay, so now if that imperialism collapses, it will have an impact on everyone in these societies across the board. I wrote about this today because, Hassan Piker, this person, he said, there's no impact of imperialism. Nobody benefits here. But in fact, we know that there's access to cheap credit that the United States gets. It pays for its imports through its dollar currency. It exports dollars and it imports 1/4 of the world's energy. That's going to impact everybody. But what will be open through the victory of the Islamic Republic is it will potentially compel these societies to turn around and look at themselves dead on. Okay, look at the founding relations of colonization of indigenous peoples here, of enslavement, of land relations here, how do you remap those in such a way that you do not need an external surplus drain, that you can generate a domestic form of wealth generation that distributes assets and resources, that allows for meaning making, that emphasizes process rather than an end of a product or a profit, that doesn't emphasize immediate pleasure and profit and Epsteinism, an unregulated, unrestrained life. So there's been a deferral for centuries, right? And the settler edge of this deferral is an unrestrained, unregulated, vicious edge. That any attempt, whether it was, there's a book by Greg Grandin, The End of the Myth. He argues that there was a election in 1840 between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, where it's not to celebrate John Quincy Adams, but there was some measure that Quincy Adams was trying to argue. Let's turn around and look at ourselves. Instead of continuing to colonize the American Midwest, why don't we have justice within? And Andrew Jackson, of course, is a slaver and a colonizer, as is Quincy Adams, is also a colonizer, but he rejects this and says, no, we don't need justice. We can just colonize and take more land. And those who don't have land right now, they can take more Indian land. Okay, but that deferred a looking in, similar to after the end of slavery. This is what Du Bois argues in America. Can American society turn around and look at itself? Can it have a reckoning and understand that the liberation of the Black worker is in fact the liberation of all? But there's a rejection of that. He's not a revolutionary in the sense Malcolm is, but Martin Luther King asked this question. Will America have its moment of reckoning now with Vietnam? But it doesn't. Okay, so this moment of reflection, but what will it take? The victory of the Islamic Republic can accelerate the contradictions here, and it can harm, or it can not harm. I could say it can intensify a certain crisis, but maybe that's a necessary thing. A sharpening of those contradictions, a revisiting of the basis of these societies. But what will compel people to organize? This is not about adventurism or spontaneity or anything like this. There needs to be a move towards a different organized basis of life that we have seen elsewhere. So that's what I would say. It's not like, I agree with you guys, nobody is going to free people in the core. This has been the question of a dignified life here, of cultivating one's soul, has been deferred for centuries because of this imperialist subsidy. This, in one way, is putting something back on the table, hopefully before it's too late.
Wow. Brother, you're spitting fire. Someone said you dropped a bouquet of mix, and indeed you did just that. I've just learned so much. Thank you for this last thing. There is this thing, I look at the psychological side of things and consider myself, part of the anti-RIF, of the shitposting brigades of the free people of the world. And the left, you put your finger on something very profound there. We in the left, first we have defeatism in our intellectual DNA, right? We've had this, we always lose, we're always on the losing side. And then we have this white savior complex also. So Cuba, we love Cuba because Cuba is always on the verge of defeat. And it's always the poor victim. So we can go, hey, let's go and do a flotilla to Cuba and show how we help the poor, helpless, whatever, especially when Trump speaks about it as if it was a future rape victim, right? And the same you could say, yes, to Palestinians also, or the poor Palestinians. But Iran are not the poor anything, right? Iran are like, we organize our own way, we do our revolution our way, we don't go for your ideologies from the West for one thing. We do it our way, with our way of, organizing around spirituality, a religious spiritual guide and all the rest of it. And you can't see them as weak. You can say, well, they've been unjustly treated, but they have never, ever come across as the weak one. And they're the supremacist mind of the Western leftist doesn't know what to do with this. Goes, oh, well, the way they treat their women, this, that, and the other thing, and it's almost like, impossible for them to go, oh, wait, there is a sovereign subject there that needs to be not just respected, they don't care that we respect them or not. It doesn't need to be helped. It is the revolutionary subject in this particular moment in time because of what the contradiction is happening. And this has to be seen, this has to be understood, this has to be learned from with the deepest possible humility. so that we can also turn around and drive a stake through the heart of this imperialist vampire here at home. So thank you very much for saying this thing, because I think this is the thing about and about Iran. And there's a little bit of the same thing going on with China also, because it's not weak. And we leftists, liberal leftists actually, which most of us are, we hate this stuff. We just want to be white saviors in leftist garbs.
Yeah, we're kind of doing, I think, our final roundup. So, Indi, if you want to,
So I've been a student today. I really appreciate the lessons. I do think everyone, as is in the comments, Adnan has linked like donating to his community in Palestine. As we think about different identities, I think, you know, if you're thinking about Palestine all the time, consider that part of your material community, consider that part of your family, and support them as, to be honest, they're supporting you. Yeah, and that's very important. That's just the only thing I'd like to close with.
Well, that's yeah. Go ahead, Bikram.
Well, I think I said what I needed to say, but I would just echo what Indi just said. I think something that when maybe to add to what I was saying, that, you know, we hold those two times that this shouldn't have happened, but this the fundraisers for folks in Gaza or Lebanon or Iran or anywhere, this is really important, you know, because the steadfastness, the ability for people to remain, and they will, but to hold and to remain steadfast, I think this is one material form of solidarity. So I just want to say kudos to you all and Adnan for censoring this work, and I just would really encourage people to support whatever the links are that I can't see the chat, but whatever it is, please do so.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I just want to reiterate that, you know, we've done lots of different kinds of fundraisers. This one, you know, hits home for me because it's something that I would really love to do, to be able to contribute something to students in Gaza as an academic. I mean, Bikram has mentioned some of the problems that we have experienced in the Western imperial cores, academy and universities, and how little genuine kind of solidarity is being expressed and risking, you know, anything. And to me, to be able to help students in Gaza continue their education, to continue learning, to express and show in a direct way that we care about them and about their futures, that they are not disposable people, they are precious resources, that the glorious future of a world without empire and colonialism will be built because of them and their struggle. And we should be equipping them with every advantage and opportunity to build that world. And to have future. So if you can, I'm going to be teaching a course called Guerrilla History, Anti-Colonial Resistance, History, Theory, Practice. We'll read a lot of great things. A lot of the people we talked about today, Fanon certainly among them, but we also have to add to the list of great anti-colonial intellectuals, many of the people that, you know, Indi was reading from, Khomeini's words, Sinwar, all these others have taught us many things. And so I would like to learn from the students, I think, actually is what will happen, but at least create some opportunity for them. So if you can, I've put the link in the chat a few times. I'll do it one more time before we leave. Please support that effort. They need internet access in order to take this course, and that's the real kind of cost. Plus, we're going to have on-the-ground TAs that we want to hire to help the students and lead discussions, and so that they can have a more enriched educational and learning experience there. So let's do that. And then, of course, Nerdine Kiswani's very important legal case. It means a lot right now to show solidarity with her when she has been the object of a nefarious plot, a violent plot to assassinate her because they want to remove her very powerful and very effective voice in solidarity with Palestine. We've had her on this show on the struggle session in the past, and we'd love to have her on again in the future. Let's help her in her efforts to try and stop the ultra-Zionist terroristic intimidation. So that also is in the chat. We've been talking about being, what politically, feeling.
So, if I may interrupt, somebody's asking how to register for your course. Will that be open to folks?
Well, it's going to be run for students in Gaza,
Okay.
so they're going to be. But I am going to, in parallel, develop and do the same course online for anybody who's interested. But first, I want to develop and make sure that I do it for the Gaza students. But anything that I do, I always try and make it generally available. So I will figure out some sort of format in which we can collectively do guerrilla history, just to say that's, the other podcast that I'm involved with. Got the t-shirt on here. You can't see it, but here we go. Guerrilla history. So I will definitely. So just stay tuned. Please give to that campaign and just stay tuned with us in this series and other things on the channel. And I'll, provide information when it's ready for ways that we can do this collectively online. Okay, so definitely you will get a chance to be engaged, but make sure the Gazan students can. It's easy for me to do it for all of you, but what about the Gazan students? So definitely add that to your donation list. Okay, well, so we've been talking about the, what it means to be, feeling politically Shi'i in this context. And we've already had one wonderful Lego video, and there's been a lot of anime, and, Irani, kind of production has really developed a new culture that's really interesting. But I wanted to show a couple of other little videos. This one is actually from before the war. And then it hit home to me, and it is really connected with me afterwards, with the assassination of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. But it's just this contrast here. It also was kind of funny. So I'm going to try and play this, and then I have just the last one that I think embodies in some sense what it means to feel politically Shi'i right now. So here, let's...
The greatest threat right now that Israel faces.
Iran. You want the 3 threats?
Give me the 3 threats.
Iran, Iran, Iran.
بزرگترین ترس بچه کشاماییم. حق داری به ترسی. تو زورت فقط به دستای خالی میرسید. رو بچه های غزه کشیدیم ملاف سفید، ولی وقتی نوبت وعده های ما رسید، نتانیاهو چی شد سمت سوراخش دوید. یادت یا نه شکست پشت شکست، 12 روز جنگ کمرت تو شکست. آخرش هم دیدی وضعیت شده خراب، رفتی التماس کردی برای آتش بس. اثر مخاطب اثر، خالق اثر، سر رس مهمه که تابع همن. وقتی سعی کردی ایرانو بریزی به هم، نمیدونستی که صاحب داره این وطن. خاموش کرد این آتیشو هم مثل قبلی ها. بچه برو تو سوراخت بذار باد بیاد.
Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei.
Oh
yeah.
My. The aura mogging, as the kids say.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I saw that one before the war, and then seeing it after, it just hit, and I thought it's been a month. It's time to remember the martyrs and the first martyr. So, yeah, but I love that sipping tea motif, and the Netanyahu at the UN when he was condemning, Iran and trying to gin up support for this war. This is like from a few years ago that he was doing it, because it's been something he's harping on for the last 35 years, coughing when he says the, Khamenei's name. And so that was really in honor of something that, a wonderful comrade, a brother of ours tweeted fairly recently, that Marxist-Leninist Khameneism is the future. And Momadou Tal, our brother, and I thought, don't sell it short. It might be the present, right now, actually. So, so that was that one, I thought. And then I'll just sort of end with this one, just a rousing sort of thing. Hopefully this will come through as well. So let me start this. با مؤمنان بگوییم فتح نهایی است، یعنی نه در احد ما در راه خیبریم. پایان با ماست، قلب میدان با ماست، پایان با ماست، قلب میدان با ماست. با دشمن کف ولی ایمان با ماست، با دشمن کف ولی ایمان با ماست. آن سو تنها جبت و تابوت است و این سو والله شاه مردان با ماست، این سو والله شاه مردان با ماست. انشاءالله نصر من الله، انشاءالله نصر من الله و فتح قریب حلی و فتح قریب. I love that one so much. I didn't play the whole. You can go find the full one. It's like another minute or so, but just that was from like very early in the war already. They wrote these new kind of poetic songs that just expressed this sense of defiance. And one thing that is a refrain in this song that I've seen so often, and even in Larijani's tweets, before his assassination, this insistence, the end is in our control. Okay. The empire started it. We will determine how and when it ends. And that is the whole reason why this is potentially very world transforming, because that revolutionary spirit is not going to compromise, and its leadership really has to be responsive to this revolutionary feeling that they want to roll back imperialism, the empire. So
victory is near, and victory is ours.
Yes, Fatahullah Qareeb. So the victory of God is near. It is near. Yes. So that's their spirits. Are very high. We can't get depressed about this. In fact, actually, we need to get inspired. Okay, because there's a role for us as well. So we should be inspired by this, and we should all be.
And what I say is always, if you ever feel like low or defeated, just remember that you're not really doing anything, and the people who are doing something are in good spirits. So be of good cheer also.
Well,
if I can just say, one thing on this point, I think yes, one should not give into defeatism, but again, like to not feel despair, but to feel though still, like do not stop feeling, because I think what Yahya Sinwar and the Al-Aqsa flood did was it exposed the world. The measure was not simply an act of resistance, but it was showing the world what it's built on. We're too late. This should never happen. But look at your world. It's built on the slaughter of children. And that's something you can carry with yourself, that pain and that anger, right? That now we see what the world is, and how could they ever expect us after Al-Aqsa flood? The flood washed away and showed us what was there. After we have seen it now, how could they expect us to go back? How could they ever imagine that we could be the same? We should have known. We were too late. But how could they ever imagine we would be the same after what we saw month after month, day after day, and what we've been seeing? And that's, I think, what Al-Aqsa flood has done to us. It changed the world, but it has reached down into each and every one of us. It's reached down deep within us and asked, what will we do now that we've seen what this world is built on? And they should never expect those who put in front of us an unrestrained, unregulated world of immediate pleasure, of Epsteinism, of the slaughter, they should never expect that we can see this and we can never be the same. There's only one direction we can go now.
Boy,
Amen.
Brother Bikrum, can we have you on every night? Boy, fantastic. So great. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you for having me on. Thank you for having me on.
We're going to make little plush toys of Bikrum that you can take home and sleep with.
Yeah. To give you consult. You can have one of those
Special
dogs.
merch.
You pull the thing and it says a lot of the, we'll
Yes.
flip some of
Yes.
these, and it'll just say some of the things.
China.
And it will come with a free Shahid 136 keyring.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. Okay. You heard it. Now people go build it. All right. That's up to you all. All right. Well, thank you everyone for being in the chat. It was a really great discussion. At some point got a little heated and personal. And so, I didn't want to have to start, banning people, but, let's be comradely. We have some differences and disagreements. We don't have to be personal and all of that. In general, though, always the high quality of the conversation in the chat, so impressive and wonderful. I'm so glad to have you here in this community and make the space for these discussions that are important to have. So I appreciate all of you for coming. Please, come back again. We'll do this again soon. Next week, we're now on a sort of weekly schedule, and do, check out Resistance is Fertile podcast, and we'll have new things coming up. But until next time, peace with justice and solidarity to you all. Salam.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.